you'll notice there's dips or there's segments in your conversion model that are just unused segments, right? And so making sure you tweak those buckets or whatever you have configured in your model to actually capture that subset of users, or making sure that you either expand or minimize those buckets to ensure that there are no dips, that each actual conversion value is used in that model.
Bottom line, how do you make SKAN work in the wild? How do you implement the right conversion model to get the right information to make the right decisions to grow your apps? Hello and welcome to Growth Masterminds. My name is John Here. Today, I want to talk about top tips for implementing SKAN. We're going to look at that by monetization model. We're going to look at that by vertical. Sometimes vertical is a key factor. Sometimes monetization model is more important. To dive in, we have two very special guests, Victor Savath, Nabia Jawani. They both work with hundreds of customers at Singular, helping them figure out the right way to get growth data on iOS. Victor is VP Solutions Consulting. Nabia leads the customer success team. Both are in the weeds on SKAN daily. Welcome, both of you.
Thank you.
Super pumped to have you. Victor, we've had you before. Nabia, it's your first time. Awesome.
Woo!
Perhaps not the last. Whoa, we're excited. Awesome. Somebody took her meds this morning. Maybe unauthorized ones, but it's all good. I'm going to start here. And it's an open question. Whoever wants to jump in on this, what's the best way, before we even talk about models, before we even talk about events, before we even talk about goals as you're setting up your monetization model, conversion model, and SKAN, what's the best way of looking at this? Is it by vertical or is it by monetization model? Anybody jump in?
I mean, to just even zoom out further, I think there needs to be a mentality and understanding that it's not a one and done exercise. And like we see iteration as kind of part of the core philosophy of approaching SKAdNetwork, not just because your KPIs change or your product changes, the ecosystem changes, right? Apple makes changes to the framework. Partners change their ability to support, different types of inventory. So like there's a need to be nimble, agile, and approach it with saying, okay, well, how do we ensure that it's going to serve, all the different needs of the organization before saying, okay, let's just like choose an event and go, which I think is part of the process as well. To be clear, like I think choosing an event and going with it is a starting point, but it's not the end goal.
Yeah,
Exactly.
like to echo. Yeah, it varies app by app and organization by organization. When you're taking a look at the macro goals of the marketing team or even just iOS measurement, it really just double downs on what the team is focused on and making sure that you have the right goals in place to hit the numbers or the traction that you need in that space. So I would say it's more focused on the vertical rather than the model in this conversation, but also for any sort of advertisers out there.
Interesting. Of course, within the vertical, you could have somebody who does IAPs, you could have somebody who does subscriptions, so that could impact everything. So we'll get into it. We'll look at it from both those different angles, both those lenses. And hopefully for whoever's listening, we'll get into exactly your vertical, exactly how you're looking at it, and maybe even your monetization model, all that stuff. Before we jump into that, Victor, you kind of hinted at it already. You always want to start with the goal. You always want to start with what is the goal here. Talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, like the goal can, of course, vary by like the end user, right? You have, analytics team, marketing teams that want, accurate reporting internally. Now, I say internally because you could say, well, we want to use SKAN to just have visibility into performance of our KPIs like ROAS. But you might also want to optimize on events for the partner, right? The goal there might be like, okay, well, I need to think through models that the partner understands these values to be funnel-based events, but I still want like visibility into ROAS performance. So that determines a very different type of setup to say, well, what type of tooling am I using? Then what kind of model should I have to ensure that partners are getting signals on events and understand them as events, but then internally I can report on, let's say, ad revenue onto the ad monetization. Right. So when we think about these goals, it's saying, well, how do we facilitate reporting? Classic measurement consideration. Facilitate reporting, then facilitate optimization on the platform. And then you get into like, okay, like what type of variables make the most sense? Which ones do we have good reads on so on and so forth. Like agnostic of the vertical at that stage, right? It's like, what am I trying to accomplish? And, who are the different stakeholders that need to be considered here?
And that's the core challenge of SKAN, really, right? Because when you had IDFA for everybody, Oprah tossing them around to everybody in the room getting an IDFA, it didn't really matter because you could do whatever you wanted. You had it forever. You could grab any events you want for almost any length that you want. The monetization, your ad partners could get whatever they needed. You could get whatever you needed. Everybody had, it was the era of plenty in terms of data. Now it's the era of scarcity, and you have to be smart about what you're grabbing so that you get what you need, but also your partners get what they need to optimize. Anything to add there, Navia, before we move on?
No, I think the key point, like Victor mentioned, is the partner optimization bit, and I think that there's so many teams facilitating the various goals and KPIs. Your engineering team might have a different focus than your UA team or growth team. So really, just understanding what those roles are and how that's going to affect the model you have in place that then affects the overall campaign strategy is going to be crucial. But yeah, with my clients specifically, I've seen a deeper focus on how partners can understand and read the scan data and making sure that those events connect. And then the second layer would be, okay, let's focus on revenue and scan revenue and models and all of that. So kind of just like getting the basics down and understanding, okay, this is going to translate between the MMP or that partner and making sure that that data is transferred correctly.
At a minimum, SKAdNetwork got, people just talking to each other more than ever, right? Because when we had the IDFA and device identifiers, you could just run traffic setup. It was clear as day, like what was, going on. But now you're like, oh, well, now I'm working Meta, and Meta has, MAI, VO, and then you're like, okay, that's their language structure. And then I have events as a subscription vertical, and I need that to translate to their framework. So now you have to engage with your measurement partner. You have to engage with a partner to say, okay, I have subscriptions. I'm trying to optimize against them. What type of inventory should I be
Yeah.
using in your platform? And then measurement partner, what kind of model works the best for mapping into their framework, right? And you're like, well, in the past, you could just send the event and know that they'd optimize against it. It was that, straight.
Yeah. And then you have the courageous clients that want to do the modeling themselves. So they're kind of like, "Wait, we don't want to use any sort of MMP. We're going to hard code the values. We're going to manage this ourselves." And that's a whole other upwards battle there. But uh, yeah.
That is challenging. Okay, let's dive into some of the good stuff. I think we'll start with looking at monetization model, and then we'll go into verticals. And so if we're looking at monetization model, whether it's a game, whether it's an app, whatever vertical it might be, let's look at ad monetization first. That's a challenging space in some areas. Your revenue per event is pretty small. You need to, it's a volume business. Fortunately, as we just heard in Growth Masterminds, Singular just implemented the ability to give postbacks on aggregate ad views. So you can do that, and you can do that in a SKAN model now, and partners don't complain because they're not getting spammed with billions of postbacks for each ad view. Victor, let's start with you. Admon, what are some tips and thoughts that you would advise a client who is monetizing via ads and using SKAN? What would they set up?
Yeah. I mean, I think admon actually has this unique benefit because when I think about conversion models more holistically, I'm always thinking about, what gives you good early signals, and then what can also give you strong predictors of quality user, strong LTV over time. So it's oftentimes, a blend of discrete variables, continuous variables. But in the world of admon, you can actually have both because you're going to have early signals, ad impressions, generally speaking. So you have these signals with a high level or decent amount of variance. So you're like, okay, I can segment these users pretty well of who's highly engaged versus not engaged, just based off of ad impression volume alone. And then you say, well, we expect a portion of those users to purchase, make in-app purchases. build the LTV. And the convenient thing is that they can all be reported against this revenue KPI, right? This revenue KPI capturing, a high value type of revenue, the IAP, as well as a high propensity type of revenue, i.e. the ad monetization. You could blend them together to say, well, let's just look at total revenue in that case, and then have a very nice range of a continuous variable to say, I now have a very strong segmentation that operates naturally to say, hey, I have a bucket of users that clearly just were engaged on ads, and then, other buckets of users that engaged with IAP as well as ads, right? So in those cases for admon, generally speaking, like the revenue-based model with custom buckets seems to be the most in it.
That makes a ton of sense, and I absolutely love that early signals because, you're putting some ads in there, maybe not the full ad load for the first couple days, but maybe it is, who knows? And you're talking about basically a mixed model, right? And you're looking at a model that is looking at some ad revenue, but also some IAP revenue. So you can set up a mixed model. There you go. Get your early signals, get your important signals, segment users. Makes a ton of sense. Nabia, I know you focus more on IAP and subscription. Anything to add on the admon side?
No, I think what Victor said was perfect. I think that it's a combination of both understanding how those revenue KPIs and those ad revenue buckets are structured in that model. So, yeah.
Hmm. Cool. Let's start with in-app purchases then with you, Nabia. So let's say, well, I got to take to a vertical. So this is the challenge with my little schema here. Yeah, I got to take to a vertical. I'm just gonna say I'm a game. Okay, I'm a game, and I have some in-app purchases. There's some special benefits. There's some power-ups. There's some extra gems or something like that. Talk about setting up SKAN conversion models when my main monetization methodology is in-app purchases and I'm a game. There's obvious challenges there, right? Like I didn't certainly buy anything in the first week of playing the game that I'm currently most focused on. It
Yeah.
probably took me months. So talk about that.
Yeah, I think that's the biggest challenge when it comes to SKAN is the limited amount of signals, but also focusing on the right signals due to the measurement period that play in the SKAdNetwork framework. So we have plenty of gaming clients who have struggled with this 24-hour initial setup. And most of my clients will have some sort of indication of like an account creation or some sort of deposit or some sort of um, avatar creation type of metric that they leverage as an indicator that signals to them that from D1 to D7, these subset of users are going to be hitting this revenue. Um, but it's all modeling based, especially with Scan 3, because within that first 24-hour period, you're right, most folks aren't depositing money or might not be hitting a certain level to buy certain characters, depending on the game. So it really just depends, but I think that taking those smaller signals like a session start or some sort of indication there and coupling it with what you know of how your Android users have been performing and comparing those two subsets have helped a lot of my clients understand where their iOS data has been going. But at the same time, with SKAdNetwork 4, you now have a lot more data, considering you have the P2 and P3 postbacks in play as well, where you have longer segments. Like your first is from 0 to 48 hours, your second is from 3 to 7 days, and then your third is from 8 to 35 days. So it's pretty much giving you additional directional signals in your P2 and P3 postbacks that could help you define um, what your revenue KPI or what your ROAS would be for those clients as well. So yeah, it's a
And that would
challenge
be
for sure.
wonderful. And that would be wonderful
Yeah.
if the industry would actually support Scan 4.
Yeah. Yep.
There's been some stumbling there, but
Yeah.
yeah, I mean, 35 days, that's going to really help, right? Maybe not so much on the optimization piece, at least not in the instant optimization piece with the ad partners, but certainly on your ability to understand the value of your cohorts. And I guess as I was listening to Nabia, Victor, what I was thinking is you better know your players insert customers, insert users, insert buyers. What you better know the people in your app really, really well to be able to model behavior and make that predictive so you can take early signals. Right, Victor?
Yeah, I think something that Bia also mentioned was the notion of observing the Android data as a reference. And building off your question or speaking to your question, it goes to this notion of reference data sets and like what can you utilize to guide the definition of your model. Now, there's this notion of, hey, let's use your early indicators to predict future behavior. But taking a step back, it's actually how do we just observe and understand our user behavior, period, first, to craft a model that allows you to then infer or at least just report on what happens over time. Right. So before you get to prediction and saying, well, you need to first reconstruct actuals. Right. So an example of that is, well, instead of just choosing revenue buckets based off of, let's say, my average product price tags in an in-app purchase, let's just look at my IDFB data set and say, like, what is the average amount generated on day one amongst users that complete the tutorial? Perhaps you use that as your revenue bucket thresholds when defining a conversion model, because then now it gives you a good segmentation group or cohort to observe and say, amongst users that complete the tutorial, they on average generate XYZ amount on the first day. Now I'm going to monitor that cohort over 3 days, over 7 days, over 30 days. You now have some indication of, how that curve builds. And then you get to your question, John, of, okay, well, what if we extend that curve and start predicting what happens to these users over, right? Where do they actually flatten out and saturate on those curves? And then thinking about, okay, what about these users that, do tutorial complete and register? What happens on day, right? So using these reference data sets, you can say, okay, now this helps us craft models that can be then applied back onto the SKAdNetwork framework, and then get to a place where you're thinking about forecasting and prediction. Right? That the weird thing with prediction is like everyone's talking about oftentimes prediction in the world of SKAdNetwork is like, even before SKAdNetwork, people were trying to figure this out. So like the first stepping stone is how do we reconstruct what you've known within the world of SKAN and then go from there.
It's such a crazy challenge, isn't it? Because let's say you do that and everybody does, right? And you find out, oh, people who go through our tutorial, they're amazing. They spend money, they stick around, they use multiple features. They're my best cohort. Great. You know what? I'm going to change my app intro and I'm going to make the tutorial really big and I'm going to prioritize it. And I might even force people to go through it. And all of a sudden you have this cohort of people who sought out the tutorial, went to the tutorial of their own free will and did certain things. And you're mapping that behavior to people that you're really shoving it in their face. Here's my tutorial. Take my tutorial. Look at my tutorial. And those are two separate groups of people. And here's, Victor, where you get to the point that you made right off the top. This is a matter of experimentation, of testing, of try this, see how it works, try that, see how it works. The challenge, Nabia, in this world of SKAdNetwork is how frequently can you test? How frequently can you change your parameters around what you're testing? You can't do it every day.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's a great question. I think that when we think about iterations of the conversion models or thinking about playing around with the various events or revenue buckets, I think that it can be at any frequency. It honestly just depends on whether the team is ready to change or shift their goals and how it's going to relay back to the partners as well, right? It's always relaying how it's going to impact your campaigns, the optimization, how much data that partner needs to then assess that set of campaigns that you're running. So I would say I've had clients change it month over month initially, right? You might optimize towards tutorial complete. registration, some sort of account creation, right? Changing those initial metrics that indicate whether someone will or will not purchase or will not deposit, and then taking that data and then modeling it out, like Victor said. So changing that first initial event indicator has been really strong with some of our customers. And that actually has proven out where, they've tested two, the third one sticks, or the first one actually sticks and the second one doesn't, right? So actually experimenting between the two to see how your IAP or subscription models will play out in the SKAdNetwork framework.
That's a
Um,
great point on like for subscription apps, right? Kind of everyone with SKAdNetwork 3 are like, oh, okay, like I'm a subscription business. There's an event I classically track, which is subscriptions, but I have a 7-day free trial. And
yeah.
they're like, well, how do I actually get any usability out of SKAdNetwork? And then in these cases, you're forced to think about, okay, maybe should I just use a session start, right? Or actually, let's think about something a little deeper of like sign up and do XYZ number of events. And amongst these customers, we definitely saw like a lot of, okay, we have to find some sort of early indicator because we just don't have visibility until, of course, as SKAdNetwork 4 was introduced, where you're like, there's some hope there, but John, you alluded to, well, that hope only goes so far. And then figure out, iterate on a monthly basis, generally speaking. And of course, there's been just changes in the ecosystem on like the impact of changing your model, right? Of like, okay, past when it first rolled out with like pause campaigns, everyone had to, reorient themselves. And now it's for sure a much more seamless experience, whether it's migrating from SKAN 3 to SKAN 4, or whether it's just switching, different model types.
Yeah. MMPs have caught up on that front, making sure that that experience is seamless. Because I recall so many customers of mine were just so cautious in changing models. It would take 48 to 72 hours. There was data loss. It was not a fun experience. And so it now has gotten a lot better.
You've added some technology, right? So that you can switch models and it's quick and there's minimal data loss.
Yep.
Isn't there also some functionality? I seem to recall there was some functionality that Singular built that was around modeling potential changes. Like if I switched my conversion model to this, what would my data output be like? Am I smoking something here?
Oh no. So there is essentially model simulation. That
You
was,
had to think about that for a minute. You
yeah,
thought I
no,
would.
it was a while back, in terms of, let's simulate using and recreating the SKAdNetwork framework to say, when we receive these events based off of, again, the IDFV data that we see, the timers of, hey, these users installed, this is essentially the number of conversion events, essentially also simulating privacy thresholds, which is another topic to say, okay, this is the event volume you would likely get. Other innovations, of course, relate to what I mentioned before around, referencing the IDFB data set. So a lot of initiatives around optimized model recommendations to say, if we have an opportunity to look at actual event volumes, event buckets, what users are actually doing, how they're actually monetizing, like why even spend any time thinking about, should my revenue bucket be between, 0 and 5, 5 to 10, 5 to 15, or just look at the device level information and say, actually, it's $0 to $3.49. It's $3.50 to $4.03. And, just do that for us. Right. So a lot of the work is, again, referencing the actuals within your device level data set to say, well, how does this best translate into the world of SDA?
Yeah.
Nice, nice.
Oftentimes with e-commerce customers or anyone who has a mixed model or IAP revenue model, you'll notice in like any sort of log level data that we have is that you'll notice there's dips or there's segments in your conversion model that are just unused segments, right? And so making sure you tweak those buckets or whatever you have configured in your model to actually capture that subset of users, or making sure that you either expand or minimize those buckets to ensure that there are no dips, that each actual conversion value is used in that model. And so I've done that exercise time and time again across my customers, especially before SKAN 4 was released, because we're now having discussions on how that model can then be used in SKAN4 and then your P2 and your P3 postbacks, and just analyzing those data sets to ensure that you're getting the most amount of data you can.
Yeah.
That is absolutely great insight, right? Because if you've got some buckets in your conversion model that aren't being used, you've got wasted bits.
Yep.
You're not capturing any information there. If you adjust that, you can get more data, more information, and that's more useful for you long term. You were going to jump in there, Victor.
Yeah, no, I think it's just an extension when we think about P2, P3 in the world of SKAdNetwork, right? Going back to the example I was laying out of, you have a cohort of a user that did tutorial complete in day one and performed in in-app purchase, right? That's operating as one of those 64 buckets, right? That's a user cohort. The beauty of P2 and P3 is you observe that user as they enter the P2 time frame or the P3 time frame, and you say, oh, that single cohort now breaks into 3 additional groups. And you say, okay, users that tutorial complete day one and purchased, made an in-app purchase. And then, in P2, they did a repeat session, they came back, or they made another purchase, or they made, a huge purchase, right? Now you have 3 groups, that one cohort split to 3. And that speaks again to the modeling rigor that can be done at that point, because we now have additional postbacks as time elapses.
Cool. And so just for everybody who's thinking, okay, all this talk about SKAN4, I can't do SKAN4 yet because none of my partners are SKAN4, they're like 10% SKAN4 data. You can actually have a SKAN4 model that is backwards compatible with SKAN3. So that ensures that you get data from SKAN4 when and where it's used. And as partners ramp up their support, which try Q1 2024, it's later than I wanted, but it is what it is. And you're still working on SKAN3. Awesome. Okay, I want to wrap this segment on the monetization model before we jump into verticals, although we've been dipping our toes into verticals the whole time. It's unavoidable. And I want to hit subscription with which Victor has already talked about a little bit. I have subscription, maybe it's a 7-day, maybe I changed my app because on iOS because of SKAN, and I made people get like a trial subscription on D1, right? And then Apple got ticked off at me because my app had no utility, right? Without somebody doing that step. Any other tips and tricks for subscription? Maybe starting with you, Nabia?
Not that I can think of, but I think what Victor alluded to was just doubling down on what you can and can't use, and maybe going back to the drawing board when it comes to understanding how your subscriptions operated or how your users operated in that subscription model prior to SKAN3, and understanding the behaviors that led to them would also be like a good starting place. But yeah, there's very minimal amount of data when it comes to subscriptions outside of just opening the app, installing, maybe doing some sort of check-in, session start, who knows, like registering, making sure you have your email inputted, right, for the actual subscription start. Um, but there's not too much in terms of event level data. But if you couple it with IDFV data, you maybe could use some of those indicators. But yeah, there's not too much. I don't know, Victor, if you have anything else to add.
It definitely, it's now speaking to subsets of subscription, because I would say that it's not always the case you don't have events, because, oftentimes, or there's a big chunk of subscription orgs that are service-based or content-based. Right. So you think about any of your streaming services, right? Any of your, music, things that you're utilizing, apps you're utilizing, you do have continuous variables that you could read signals into, right? But again, are they, they're good early indicators and they're plentiful. Are they good indicators of, LTV? That's, I think, the ultimate question, or you didn't actually have to guess. You'd say they just renewed, or the trial completed and they converted. So generally speaking, it's things like how many times did they listen? How many times did they actually use the service in the free trial, right? What type of subscription did they actually, was it a family plan, an individual plan, student plan, that they engaged with, right? So there are attribute types that can still be observed around the subscription, which then says, okay, again, I'm going to monitor this cohort over time and see what is the propensity of, users that did XYZ number of listens or consumption for the student plan, right? Well, they're students and, they might have limited, disposable income, and then there's a higher drop off when you get into day 7, right? Well, let's look at the family plan amongst users that consume at this amount. And then that shows essentially different performance. Again, observing that device level data set, say, okay, cool, that has different performance. But unless you're maximizing that number of buckets that Nabia alluded to, it's like you're going to lose out of it. If you just say, I'm just going to look at total number of listens. And you're like, well, you forgot or you missed out that there's actually student subscription types, family subscription types, and then average users. And then those could actually refine the reporting, which then helps.
A great point.
I love that term disposable income. I mean, like, I've got some disposable, I'll just dispose of this income. But I think the other, I think the other thing that's helping subscription apps now is, well, there's the hope of Scan 4 in the future and longer time frames, which will help. But I think the other thing that's helping subscription apps is there was this time, I want to say about a year ago, everything had to be subscription. Everybody was going to subscription. You must have subscription. It's the next thing. And there was this wave of pure subscription apps. And I think that perhaps it was the economic downturn. Perhaps it was, I don't want 1,000 little holes poked in my bank account, draining it out. That disposable income is getting too disposable, right? I'm disposing of it too quickly. And so I think a lot of apps have gone to more hybrid modes of monetization, some ads, some IAPs,
Yeah.
and some subscriptions, and gotten smarter about that. And that provides more signal as well. And you have, you can segment, you've got cohorts, you got more data over more time. So I think that helps. Okay. I want to jump into vertical specific. And I think the first one we'll hit is retail. And retail is an interesting one, right? Because there's typically, if you're going to download a retailer's app, and we'll hit quick service retail, fast food in a bit as well. And that there's a different model there. That's a loyalty model and everything like that. But if you're going to download a retail app, typically there's a purchase you want to make from that particular company. And so you might make it right away. So does that make it pretty easy? Maybe that's not always the case. I'm not entirely sure. Who wants to hit retail first?
Go for it.
Pick me, everybody says. Nabia goes.
Yeah, I think that the complexity is oftentimes with retail and e-commerce, right? There is a catalog, and it's oftentimes highly dependent upon what's offered there. Going into this idea of like, oh yeah, they made a purchase. That's a good indicator. That's, I think good and honestly good enough. But then if you want to get into, well, how do you actively craft, revenue buckets, especially if you have sneakers and electronics kind of in the same marketplace, then your revenue KPI become really, I don't know, like they're very average. So yeah, generally speaking, we think about retail from the perspective of, initial purchase events and then engagement. To your point on, a big goal of retail is not necessarily the first purchase, it's the recurring purchase on the life cycle. And that's been a big limitation with SKAN 3 out of the gates is don't really have good visibility into the world of re-engagement, right? And so, when we think about SKAN 5 and, the innovations that Apple's making around saying, well, how can we ensure that we can support the world of re-engagement? I think that speaks highly to not just retail, but things like as well. Any business that really depends on not just the initial engagement, the initial conversion, but the recurrence of
And that kind of speaks to the importance of being able to model cohorts, right? Because, IDFA mostly gone. It's kind of lost the ability to do cohorts. Now Singular enables modeled cohorts. When you model those cohorts and you watch them through time, then you get some better sense. That may not be super helpful in the moment, but that gives you some insight over time. Anything else, Nabia?
No, I think that the re-engagement piece is key, and that can be extended to most apps and most verticals is, making sure that you're capturing that second deposit or the second time someone books, a flight or whatever secondary action there is where someone coming back to the app is so key. And that's been a big miss in terms of SKAN 3. But yeah, I think the biggest challenge with SKAN 3 is making sure that you have the correct revenue buckets that capture that first purchase and then potentially a secondary purchase or a tertiary purchase all in that same model. And so the unlock with P2 and P3 postbacks is just having those additional signals that indicate someone's coming back or someone's making a different purchase or they're viewing another item in a specific catalog. And I think that also will be helpful with Scan 4. But yeah.
Yeah, I guess I also wanted to make sure that listeners here could make sure that we differentiate between the reporting layer and the partner optimization layer, because in the retail use case, you might not actually deploy a revenue-based model. You might have, an engagement and event funnel model, right? Because their user funnel, somebody arrives, somebody signs up, somebody adds the cart, somebody posts checkout, and then essentially, they're the full converted user. If you have that type of model, Singler's in a place where even if that's your model, you still have revenue reporting, revenue cohorts, because you could say, I'm again using that funnel as a way of segmenting my IDFB data set. And I'm going to observe these cohorts and see the actual revenue that they generate over time and report on those revenue inferences within the singular, reporting interface, such that the networks can be optimizing off events based off how the model's configured. But from an analytics, LTV reporting perspective, you're like, oh, I can also see the revenue. So we have a lot of cases where we are ensuring that there's the complete reporting, and oftentimes maybe just a subset of what we see in the reporting is actually utilized for the purposes of campaign optimization.
Cool. Very cool. Super interesting. Okay, let's switch verticals. Let's go to fintech. Fintech is super interesting. It's going to be a much lower volume, install volume vertical than, let's say, games, certainly hyper casual, everything like that. But the value of each person you get in a fintech app is astronomical in a lot of cases, especially when it's a banking app and other things like that. Now, that might be a different user acquisition model, right? Because if you're a traditional bank, well, somebody gets your app just so that they can have a simpler way of working with you. But if you're a neobank, that might be customer acquisition in terms of downloading the app, right? Talk about some of the things in fintech that you might want to think about when it comes to SKAN.
Yeah, I think fintech is a tough one in terms of the verticals laid out here. But from my experience, I've seen most customers do a mixture of both engagement metrics and revenue metrics to capture users that who initially have engaged with the app, have inputted a certain level of information into the app, have connected various accounts within that app as an indicator of how active that user is. And then at the same time, on the revenue front, we're capturing potentially the amount of money deposited or the amount that's been used in a transaction. Um, so those are common use cases that we've seen. I've seen less of a funnel model in fintech, but that isn't to say that fintech can't use that because it's very similar to retail where there might be a sequence of someone's actions when they come to the app, they create an account, they do X, Y, and Z. Um, but again, it's lower engagement in terms of what you would see with like retail promotion, first orders, all of that.
Hmm. And it has these amazing, like, did I connect my bank account, right? Did I deposit
Yeah.
money? Did I make a, those these big steps that somebody if somebody makes, they're pretty serious and could last a long time. So those are pretty interesting. We got to keep moving. I know you guys don't have forever. Do you? Can you spend another hour with me? Probably not. Um, I'm gonna keep going. Let's hit on demand. On demand kind of hits me like retail on steroids, where if I download an on-demand app, maybe I saw an ad, maybe I had like $10 off your first, Uber Eats order or something like that, right? But if I'm downloading an on-demand app, I'm probably using it right away. Am I right, Victor?
Yeah. I mean, the common case we will see is, optimizing against the bookings, the initial first orders, first rides, whatever that may be, first trip, oftentimes preceded by some sort of KYC sign up, registration, authentication event. And then, going into the world of continuous variables is where we're thinking about the behavior. Revenue amounts, are definitely not as common given the high level of variance between trip length, duration, being kind of factors there. So it's really around engagement and frequency. of utilization.
Yeah.
Cool. Uh, I want to hit social. Social is an interesting one, because you might there's obviously the use case where somebody is on a network, maybe on the web, and then they get the app. I mean, but often when you're downloading social, you might be starting from zero. And in social, that's an interesting place to start from, right? Because if your network is zero, there's no value. Like the first telephone ever created had zero value. You couldn't call anybody, right? And you're on a social network, you have nobody. So your events are really challenging. So people have to work really hard to surface the best information. TikTok's got it easy there because they just use an algorithmic thing. Everybody's learning from that. Talk about social, Nabia. If you're a social app, how do you use SKAN to monitor, measure, and increase your growth?
Yeah, I think it's very similar to potentially the other verticals. I think the initial first couple of events that you're tracking are going to be key indicators in terms of why that user is on your app, how long they're going to stay on the app, whether they're going to delete the app. So those key indicators are going to be really, really crucial to understanding. Okay, is this user going to be, carries a lot of value or not? But some of the key identifiers again would be authentication, making sure you have the connections between other platforms to the social app, whether it's referrals to friends, making sure that those are some of the key events that you're tracking with social.
Cool, cool. And Victor, I want to kind of go to gaming again, and I want to hit on hyper casual versus, let's say, mid core, and some of the challenges and differences there. I mean, in the hyper casual world, it's not unknown for a game to blow up and get big and then be gone in weeks or months or something like that. Mid core is very different. Talk a little bit about using SKAN in those worlds.
Yeah, I think it goes hand in hand with some of the points that we made around ad monetization, right? So, we oftentimes see actually some of the strongest reads and cleanest reads amongst hyper casual because you have so many more signals around engagement, albeit within a very condensed, time frame. It's almost like SKAdNetwork was designed for, this use case because you're talking about users that are engaging what they do within the first day. And then oftentimes the life cycle of hyper casual is much more truncated than that of mid-core. So when, thinking about those situations, you have a higher propensity of ad monetization being, the business model. There's usually generally very strong reads in terms of revenue in the first day. And, you know, those use cases are suffice. When we think about mid-core type titles, that's where you need to start thinking about, okay, well, beyond day one, what is the monetization strategy? What are we thinking as continuous variables that are occurring early on, like level completions, tutorial completes, might be more further necessitated just based off of, lower percent coming from ads versus like,
And segmentation probably gets more important in the mid core space as well. Cool. We got to call a wrap. I know you guys have things to go to, and I've got something coming up as well. This has been a lot of fun. This has been interesting. I hope you've enjoyed the experience, especially you, Nabia, first time on Growth Masterminds. I want to thank you both. The reason I wanted you on here is you've talked to literally hundreds of clients. You've looked at hundreds of scenarios. And there's something really amazing about somebody who spends all their time looking at one particular app or one set of apps. There's also something very amazing about somebody who looks at hundreds of them, dozens of them, and you see commonalities and you see differences. And being able to figure that out and being able to share some of the insights you've gleaned from that is super valuable. Thank you so much for this time.
Yeah.
awesome.
Thank you for having
Thank
us.
you.